I've had a numerous array of assignments to include working internal affairs for 4 years, 3 years as a sergeant, 1 year as a captain. I was a lieutenant in charge of the operations for Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center, including I was an area command captain, and then my most recent and latest assignment for the last 17 months has been with the Internal Oversight and Constitutional Policing Bureau. So this bureau was established in 2012 with the sole mission to significantly reduce deadly force incidences. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is just to kind of give you an idea of what happens when an officer-involved shooting happens. So when we get the notification that an officer-involved shooting happens, I actually have 2 teams that respond. My first team is the Force Investigation Team. They are there to immediately conduct a criminal investigation to determine if the actions of the officers are within state law and the U.S. Constitution. They do this by conducting interviews, reviewing body-worn camera, collecting evidence, and as a matter of fact, at least 1 to 2 members of the district attorney's office accompany them so that they also get the preliminary details and are able to watch the body-worn camera footage when we do our initial review. This team is also responsible for providing the sheriff with a briefing. You may hear that we always push out a briefing within 72 hours of an officer-involved shooting, and rarely do we go past that 72-hour mark. And then this information that we provide to the sheriff is then provided and pushed out in a press conference to the PIO so that the media and the public are aware of the details of the incident that occurred. So now the FIT detectives start continuing their investigation, and it does take time. We do have to wait for autopsies and toxicology reports and forensics information to come in for firearms. Once all that information is in, the FIT detectives compile their investigation, and it goes through numerous oversight proceedings through the sergeant, the lieutenant, and myself. And then the case is submitted to the district attorney. The district attorney will review it to determine if any charges will stem from this incident. So then if no charges are filed against any law enforcement officer, the case will then go to a police fatality public fact-finding review. The lead case agent on the incident will go and testify and articulate the details of the incident. And in the spirit of transparency, this is televised on the local cable network for everybody to see the details of the criminal investigation that occurred. The other team that responds, and they have an entirely separate mission, but they respond as well, is the critical incident review team. Their job is the administrative function, the administrative review. So they pick apart the call for each deadly force incident and determine if the officer's actions were within policy, procedures, tactics, and training, and determine what they can do better as an officer or us better as an agency. What we could have done better, so if the same or a similar incident were to happen that night, later that night or the next day, what could we do better so that we have an outcome where force didn't have to be used? This team is incredibly thorough as well. They document every detail of our employees' actions. This starts with the 911 call that happens to come in, if it came in through 911, or the initial police stop, the car stop or the person stop. They look at the officer's response, the pre-planning, the de-escalation efforts, the actions taken, the supervisory response, and the post-incident handling of the situation. CERT that night will also be accompanied by at least 2 of our citizen board members from our Citizen Use of Board. They respond. And we get shootings. Unfortunately, officer-involved shootings happen 24 hours. So we've had them come out at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. We've had them respond to Apex. We've had them respond to Laughlin. And these citizens put up their time and they drive out to the scene so that they get a first-hand look of the incident scene that night that the officer went through and get the preliminary details of what happened. This way that they're able to come back later and we use these citizens and they actually have a vote regarding the use of force board as to whether the officer's actions were justified and within LVMPD policy. So the vote I just mentioned occurs when the CERT team provides this highly detailed presentation for the board. And remember, there's 2 boards that are going on now. There's a use of force board, and then there's a tactical review board. So the use of force board occurs first, and sitting on this board is 4 civilian volunteers, as well as 3 Metro staff members. They determine whether or not, and they vote whether or not the officer's actions were justified based on our policy. The tactical review occurs immediately after the use of force and consists of the officer's chain of command, peer members, and subject matter experts. Now, this board is going to vote on findings to determine if the officer's actions were within policy, procedure, or training, or if policy, procedure, and training was insufficient, and us as an agency need to make changes and updates and do additional reviews, because again, we're a learning department with the goal of improving continuously. So after these boards occur, then the findings from the force investigation team's report that they produce, as well as the key findings that were determined during the tactical review board, these are all placed onto the LVMPD website for the public to review. They're on there now. Once the entire review process is complete. So we can't place a fit report and then the cert report at the same time. They all have to be done once the entire process is complete. And then furthermore, all this information, again in the spirit of transparency, gets polled and gets put into our annual use of force report, which is what I want to talk to you about next. Do we have the annual? So why do we do this report? So in short, this is a way for us to identify emerging trends and needs. We currently review every use of force report on a weekly basis, but this provides us a statistical analysis, a data comparison for not just a year, but for a 5-year period. So we can see if there's anything that we need to take notice of and correct. We continuously are providing critical self-analysis in our use of force reports, which results in adjustments to our training, our policy, our procedures, our education within the agency. So for instance, in 2019, we had 47 recommendations that went up through staff for updates, changes, reviews regarding equipment, policy, procedure, and training were submitted. All of these recommendations are in this report, again, as a learning agency. And then we know that the sheriff is completely committed to being transparent and accountable for all aspects of use of force to make sure that the public's receiving the highest quality of service. So a couple things. This report gets posted on LVMPD website, usually in May of every year. And I get to ask the question a lot about why May. If it's the 2019 report, why aren't we getting it January 1 of 2019? Well, the reason is that when the use of force reports happen, it has about 30 days to get through the chain of command for a complete review. So then it comes to us, and then we actually have to analyze and compile the report, create the report, and then it goes through multiple steps of review before it actually gets posted. So historically, we post them in May, and it is available. It's available today for your review. And this year's report covers 2015 through 2019, which again, we're looking at a 5-year data set compared to just 1 year to compare. And I just want to cover a few things that you're going to see in this year's report. So one of the things you're going to see is that LVMPD used force on subjects 925 times during 2019. And that's an increase of 7% from last year. Police account for 82% of those. Corrections officers account for 18%. Why more corrections, or why more POs than COs? Well, there's more citizen interaction with police versus a contained correctional facility. And I think it's important to note out of those 925 instances that, and these are again, the non-deadly use of force, the reportable use of force instances. In 2019, 22% of those, so about 207 of those 925 were documented as complaint of injury only, which means that there was no visible injury. It's just that the subject complained that they were hurt. Therefore, we take the report. Their handcuffs may have caused pain when they were getting placed on. So we take that as a report, and that gets counted. I also want to give you a little bit of insight regarding the 925 uses of force in a more global perspective. One of the new graphs that you're going to see in this year's report, it's actually a graph that has several circles on it, and it's kind of giving you a global perspective. So the first circle is going to be the Las Vegas community, the tourists. We're looking at 42.5 million tourists who came to Las Vegas in 2019. And then we add that to the population of 1.7 million. Now, these are potential police contacts, the contacts that we could be making. And now I want to look at, inside from that, you'll see a smaller circle, which is the actual times that we contacted people. And this is based on calls for service and officer-initiated stops, perimeter checks, car stops, person stops. So we're looking at 1.6 million times that we actually contacted a citizen. Out of those 1.6 million, we used force 925 times, which is about 0.05% of the time. It's less than 0.5% of police contacts result in any kind of reportable force. And I'm just saying this again to give you a little bit more global perspective. And if when you get a chance to pull up the report, look at that document and you'll see that graph and it'll help clear it up a little bit. Next slide. Also, I want to just touch on officer-involved shootings. So from last year, from 2018 to 2019, our officer-involved shootings went down 27%. We went from 22 in 2018 down to 16 in 2019. Currently, this year, year-to-date 2020, we have 10 officer-involved shootings, which is an additional decrease of 9% from this time last year. And then I want to touch on the demographics of the subjects involved. In 2019, the subjects in which deadly force was used on was white, 59% of the time, black, 24% of the time, Asian, 12%, and Hispanic, and 6%. And all the officer-involved shootings that had a fatal outcome involved white male subjects in 2019. Again, all this demographic information is listed in the report, and we have it broken down for deadly uses of force, non-deadly uses of force, as well as the demographics of the officer who used the force, both on the deadly and non-deadly side. And then we also have it broken down by a community makeup. So I encourage you again to look at this report so that you have the information and you have the accurate information. Another section of this report is going to break down the less than lethal tools, the number of time that they were used and their effectiveness. So for instance, less than lethal shotgun usage increased 180% last year. We used it, and it sounds 180% sounds wow, but it's actually, we used it 14 times. This was a less than lethal shotgun. We used it 14 times for 180% increase. The 40 millimeter impact weapon, we saw an increase of 500% usage, which we used it 30 times in 2019, but that's a 500% increase. But I want you to remember that beginning in April of 2018, this tool became available for patrol. Before, it was just available for SWAT and CERT teams. Now we have over 2,000 officers who are trained to use this tool, and the officers are utilizing these tools versus resorting to a deadly force right away. And I want to bring up, for instance, in regards to edged weapons. In 2018, we used deadly force on 6 subjects that were armed with an edged weapon. Last year, that number dropped to 0. That is because of the amount of tools and the continual de-escalation training that we are providing these officers. You would not have seen that 10 years ago, but we're seeing the strides and the efforts of this department making a change. So, in closing, I want you to take the time to review this report. It's available online, and I encourage you to look at it, to go through it, and to ask the questions. If you have questions, please reach out to my office. But one other thing I want to talk about real quick is becoming part of the process. We have a lot of people who ask about, how do I become part of this citizen board process? Well, that is available also on the website. So if you go to lvmpd.com and you scroll down to where it says transparency, you're going to click on internal oversight. That's my bureau. And you can scroll down to the bottom and it says the critical incident review process. This has the application and waiver on there. So it's got the information about the process, what we're looking for, because we're not looking for government haters, but we're also not looking for, hey, Metro's #1. We want people who want to be involved in the community and want to give an unbiased opinion, see what is going on, sit through the extremely detailed process and review and oversight of these officers' actions, and vote. Have a vote, have a say. So we're always looking for additional citizens to participate, and I encourage you to pull up that application and submit it. And we will reach out to you and we will get the process started for you.
Captain Splinter, we received an email asking if you could talk about the 925 times that force was used and what type of force that was. What does that mean? What kinds of force does that entail?
The most, and I actually don't have the number in front of me right now, but the actual #1 use of force was actually a takedown technique. So that was officers going hands-on. But the use of force report will break down how many times force was used, what type of force, and its effectiveness. So it'll tell you that if we had 35 canine bites, what was the effectiveness of those canine? Again, these are all less than lethal options in an attempt to get a situation safely under control.
And I need you to repeat the question here.
I'm sorry.
No, not that one, but this one. But when can you use force?
Okay, the question is, when can you use force? Officers can use force to facilitate an arrest. It's the last thing we want to do, and we have changed and focused our culture since 2012, since the DOJ came in and we asked them to take a look at our use of force and our officer-involved shootings and tell us what can we be doing better. So the focus has primarily shifted at that time to de-escalation, and the de-escalation aspect has been ingrained ever since people start the academy, through all their annual training, through their reality-based training courses that we adjust every year to mimic what we're starting to see out in the field. And then we provide these tools. So we do not want to use force. That's not our hope is. Unfortunately, that's an aspect that sometimes we can't avoid, but I hope that answered that question.
What is the process that an officer goes through before they are put back in the field after an officer-involved shooting?
So the question is regarding when an officer gets into a shooting, before we release them back to the street, what kind of process do we send them through? So that's a really good question. And Metro has an extremely robust system of review when an officer gets into a shooting. So once they're placed on administrative leave, and they're placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. While they're on administrative leave, they're required to go see a doctor. They see a psychologist to talk about what occurred. They see them for a set number of appointments to go by, because this is an extremely traumatic experience. And I went through it myself in 2007, and you go talk to the doctor about what's going on and how you're dealing with the stress. After that, the doctor will release them to go back to a training scenario. So we will actually put them through multitude of training scenarios to include something that's similar to the incident that they dealt with. But we'll also look at additional reality-based training, firearms training, de-escalation training, and we will put them through a series of training that they have to pass successfully. Once that happens, then the officer will get sent back to the doctor. And the reason for that is because a lot of new emotions will come back up, especially after reliving and going through the training of something that was very traumatic in your life. Once that occurs and a doctor then feels that the officer can return, then they have to go through what's called a return to duty board. So they sit through a board where we talk, and the board includes people from training, people from my office, people from internal affairs, from our PEEP organization, and their chain of command, and we'll sit down and we'll talk about, do we feel that this officer is ready to come back, yes or no, and why, or does it need to be in a TDY status? How do we want to approach it that we can reintegrate this officer safely back into the community without the stressors of what they've been dealing with? Then that memo actually gets through the chain of command all the way up through the sheriff. to give the yay or nay or whether or not this officer is ready to return to duty. We want to set them up for success, so that's why the process is very lengthy.
Can you address the reality-based training that occurs following an officer-involved shooting and the scenarios that are created based on an incident, and why we use those incidents for training purposes?
So the question is about what kind of reality-based training we put the officers through. And it really depends on the scenario that they specifically went through. If it was a car stop that ended up in a shooting, we may put them through a car stop situation, but we really want to touch on and recapture the de-escalation portion and what they could have done better. And it may have been nothing that they could have done better. It was just a very unfortunate incident and a threat that they had to address at the time that they felt that they had to use deadly force. But we continuously look at the use of force reports that come in, and if we start seeing a pattern, we address it. We don't wait for this annual use of force report to come out. And one example I can give you is last year we had more than one shooting regarding subjects fleeing in a vehicle. So the department recognized this, and we immediately reviewed policy. We made policy much stricter and clearer to give these officers better direction as to how to deal with that type incident. And then we put officers through that, and we can adjust the reality-based training for all officers. We'll push out awareness reports to remind them about the policy. We actually pushed out a video from another agency that was very potent, and we felt, well, this is good, let's use it, and reached out to them with their approval. And then our union even pushed out a video, which was extremely potent to our officers. So we haven't seen that this year, so I think that's something that's working, but we do that anytime we see any kind of aspect that's going on, not just in this agency, but we'll keep an eye on everything nationwide because we know that it could affect our agency as well.
Can you talk about the early intervention program that the department has had now for about 12 years and how it helps us to identify officers who might be having problems following either an officer-involved shooting, excess use of force, or other problems in their career? Because this is something we've been asked quite a bit since the incident in Minnesota with George Floyd, and the main officer in that incident had 17 prior use of force cases in his file. So talk about how EAP has assisted this department in identifying those issues and also treating our officers and addressing issues they might be having.
So again, I think LVMPD leads the way in regards to our early intervention program that we have with our officers. So as any incident that occurs with an officer, if an officer has a use of force or a statement of complaint, a complaint came into the officer, it's going to get logged in our system. If the officer gets, I believe it's 3 or more now, it will, we call it light up. It'll light up on their system, and an alert goes to the supervisor to say, are you aware that your officer has had 2 uses of force within this period, a certain amount of period, as well as a statement of complaint, or the officer might have a personal problem that's going on and going through a divorce or child custody hearing, something that may affect the officer and how they perform out in the field. And this way we can actually monitor the officer. It's required that the supervisor immediately address the officer, talk to them, determine if we're starting to see a pattern, and what we can do to help these officers. Because again, we want to set them up for success, but we want to make sure that the community is getting the best quality of service from all of our officers in the street. So it's addressed, those notifications go through the supervisor, then they go through the lieutenant and the captain to make sure that that has occurred.
Last question. How does Metro's review process compare with other agencies in Nevada and even around the country?
I think LVMPD has the most robust and transparent and accountable process in the nation. we have so much oversight in regards to the use of force and officer-involved shootings and pursuits, and we look at everything critically. We pick it apart, and again, we try to figure out what can we do better as an agency? What do we need to fix? And we just finished an entire revamp of our use of force policy. That happened to get pushed out in May, but we have been working on that since October. And it's been weekly meetings of a reread and a rewrite of our use of force policy. And our goal was to make it clearer for these officers so that we can give them better direction and we can provide them more information so they can go out and do their job better. So we have other agencies across the nation who are continuously reaching out to us to find out about our process, to find out about our oversight, to find out how do we bring citizens in to review the actions of these officers and actually have a voting say as to whether or not their actions were within policy and were justified. And then we document all this and we push it out to the public so that they can see the work that we've done, the efforts we place. And I can't emphasize enough the use of force, the annual use of force report that's online, to pull it up. Thank you very much for tuning in today and for the fantastic questions. Again, please pull up the use of force, annual use of force policy. It breaks down so much information. I know it's over 75 pages, but it will answer every one of your questions. And then if you have any suggestions with how to improve it for next year, I'm all ears. This department is completely open to reform. We've embraced it. We have a documented history of change. We will continue to change and we'll continue to improve this department in every aspect that we can. Thank you and stay safe.